Real Country 1430 AM and 107.3 FM WRDN. I'm Brian Winnekins, and joining us today is Dr. Mark Stephenson. He is with the University of Wisconsin Center for Dairy Profitability, and he's the director, and we're going to talk about the Dairy Margin Coverage Decision-Making webinar that's coming up December 3rd at 12 noon. And Dr. Stephenson, again, thank you for joining us. Well, remember last year when everyone was saying, boy, 2020 is going to be a great year in the dairy markets, and like that dairy margin coverage thing, we don't need it. And then March hit. So this is probably something every dairy farmer needs to attend.
Yeah, Brian, that's, I think, true. I don't know if they need to attend it, but I think they need to think about dairy markets as having risk. And that's what this is all about. It's risk management. It's not trying to outguess what the markets are going to do. And honestly, if a pandemic isn't just the very definition of risk, I don't know what is. In 2019, you were right. The fourth quarter, we had prices coming up. Things were looking a lot more optimistic, the futures markets, and people like myself were expecting that 2020 was going to be a continuation of that price recovery and a pretty good year. And then by the time we got to February, March, April, news about that pandemic, well, it wasn't even called a pandemic until April, but was getting worse. And by the time we got to April and safer at home, dairy markets and virtually every other aspect of our economy just hit the wall. And, you know, we had some real problems. So those who signed up last year for dairy margin coverage, I think felt pretty good about it. Across all milk, that dairy producers who covered tier 1 at the 950 level are going to average something like 60 cents a hundredweight for the entire year. So they had some months with big payouts and some with no payouts, but that's still, you know, pretty substantial payment. That, by the way, is a net benefit, net of that 15 cent per hundredweight premium that they paid. So it's been a good program, and I urge producers to think about signing up this year.
Talking with Dr. Mark Stephenson. He is the director for the UW Center for Dairy Profitability, talking about a dairy margin coverage decision-making webinar that will be held December 3rd at 12 noon. So, Mark, for those that will attend this webinar, what will they learn, or how will they, I guess, learn on how to be able to punch in all the numbers and all of that to try and make a decision on whether or not to take part in this program?
You know, Brian, in response to the statement you started out with, you know, talking about how people really got fooled in some sense, you know, from last year, we decided to make a significant change in that dairy margin coverage decision tool that we had. That tool was using futures and options market to try to forecast what we thought the margin was going to be. And a lot of people did make decisions based on the fact it didn't look like we were expecting any payouts at the end of December 2019 for the year 2020. Turns out we've made a lot of payouts. And that's really what risk is. So we changed the tool a lot. We turned it around. We're still using futures and options contract, but this time we're only calculating what we expect the cost of feed to be. And from that, we can give people an idea about the level of milk coverage, or, you know, milk price that they're actually covering. So, you know, that's putting it more, I think, with a risk twist on it, just to say, you know, look, how much protection do you have with the given feed prices that we expect? So I think that people can go in and use that tool pretty simply and, you know, take a look at that. We also have a historic section on that tool this year that lets you go back, even though we didn't have the dairy margin coverage program over previous years, except last year. We can go back and we've got the values and we can look and see what the payments would have been had that program been in place. And, you know, basically, if you look back over the last decade or so, there's been 1 year in which we didn't receive any payments at the 950 level of protection, and that was 2014. That was such a good milk price year. That program would have never kicked in, but in many other years it did, and the payments would have been substantial. So we'd like people to think about what's likely.
Talking with Dr. Mark Stephenson, he's director of the UW Center for Dairy Profitability. Again, talking about upcoming webinar on the dairy margin coverage decision making. This will be December 3rd at 12 noon. And Mark, you mentioned you added those feed costs into this tool. Are there other issues along with the futures and options of milk? Are there going to be other things that producers need to maybe think about? Again, yes, we have the cost of feed. Does that include cost of fertilizer, cost of fuel, cost of those inputs? Because we're starting to hear that there's potentially going to be some increases in fertilizer and those sort of things coming up next year, and that would again potentially adjust the cost of feed. Is that how that'll work?
It could, and again, you have to think about the much bigger picture here. This is not your feed costs. This is a national benchmark of what we expect feed costs will be based on corn prices and soybean meal prices and, alfalfa hay prices. So what we do with that, if those prices all rise, the inputs for growing those crops rise, then we would expect that the price of corn will rise as well. As we've seen, it's been coming up. So, your feed costs come up. Right now, if you look at, what kind of protection are we expecting? We're expecting that we would have something in the way of a U.S. all milk price, which is what the Dairy Margin Coverage Program protects against. With the feed prices we have at right around $19 a hundredweight. So, that's just saying that that's what a 950 level of protection would give you, is a coverage protection at something like $19 per hundredweight of milk.
Wow.
Now, you can adjust that. We've had, roughly a relationship between class 3 and the U.S. all milk price at something like a minus $1.30. And if you put something like that into the as a basis into that web thing, you'll see that now we're protecting something like an $18 class 3 price. So farms can go ahead and use that just to try to customize it a bit to say, what kind of milk price am I protecting, and does that give me an adequate income? If it does, then maybe 15 cents is inexpensive, cost to protect that level.
Sure. And that was one of the other big parts of this year was we got that price differential that hit. I mean, yeah, I'm announcing $3 cheese and 20 some dollar class 3 milk. And, on the surface of it, those that didn't know how that price differential worked, they would be like, well, wow, the dairy farmers, they got a nice recovery. But then we find out, oh, no, wait a minute, we need to adjust your price here, and we're going to take away $10 a hundredweight, and all of a sudden it's not so good anymore. So that's another reason why producers really need to be looking into this.
That's quite true. Although this kind of analysis that we're doing here in this coverage does not protect you against that, what we would call basis risk, that negative PPD. But if your class 3 price falls, it doesn't matter what the PPD is, whether it's positive or negative. If it fell to say $16, you'd be expecting something like a $2 payment per hundredweight. So, this is going to be triggered as a payment regardless of what the PPD does.
Talking with Dr. Mark Stephenson, he is director of policy, or director of UW Center for Dairy Profitability, talking about a dairy margin coverage decision-making webinar this morning. That's going to be coming up on December 3rd. It'll start at 12 noon. Mark, how long will the webinar be approximately?
I'm shooting for about half an hour, and we're going to try to cover it quickly because I don't think it's terribly complicated. We'll talk a little bit about the program itself and the sign up for it, and going through and having people see what they can do to make their decision. And then I'll also give just a very brief outlook for what I think may be happening with milk prices. This is a year, I can tell you right now, that I got a lot more question marks than I have good, solid information. We just have to watch and see how the pandemic plays out. We are hopeful at this point in time about things like, a very effective vaccine. but it'll take a while for that to be put into place. And we've seen very volatile milk prices as people have gone from, long-term demand forecasts that used to be about a year, out to something like 4 weeks. So long-term is actually not very long because restaurants open, they need cheese, and so they order it, and then restaurants get closed again, and all of a sudden, they don't want a lot of cheese in inventory. So everything is very short-term in nature, and it's yanking prices around pretty quickly.
And then, of course, if the government suddenly says, "Oh, we're going to do the food box program again," that also then changes everything, because now all of a sudden we need cheese again.
It does. And we saw before that, if cheese prices drop pretty rapidly, that can spur export sales of the product. When cheese dropped to $1, that's not a good thing for class three, but wow, the rest of the world looked at that and said, that's a good price on cheese, let's buy some. So, that was part of rapid recovery and volatility too.
Talking with Dr. Mark Stephenson. He's director of the UW Center for Dairy Profitability. Again, coming up on December 3rd is a dairy margin coverage decision-making webinar, and that will start at 12 noon. And Mark, for producers that want to sign up, how can they sign up?
Oh boy, that's a good question, and you shouldn't have asked me that. I don't have it at my fingertips. Scott Roos is handling the registration link. It's no cost, but if you sign up, then you'll get the access link to the webinar. So if you go to wisc.edu/extension, you'll be able to see the links there for the page.
All right. Well, Mark, again, pretty important webinar for dairy producers. Again, you can go to wisc.edu. That's wisc.edu. You'll find the link for that dairy margin coverage decision-making webinar coming up on December 3rd at 12 noon with Dr. Mark Stephenson. And Mark, again, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
You're listening to WRDN.